Hi everyone, my name is Damian Maduzia, and today I'm going to walk you through some key accessibility concerns to have in mind when working on a common UI scenario, a variant selector. This talk follows a practical approach and hence case study in the title. But before we start, a quick intro. I work as a developer at House of Angular, and I got into the world of accessibility 3 years ago when I was working in a media industry on an application with strict accessibility requirements. This challenge pushed me to dive into this topic, and over time, as I was learning more about it, I found out that, first of all, writing accessible code doesn't have to be hard or time-consuming, and that it can even sometimes be fun, which is the mindset I would like to leave with you today. Besides that, I like to push limits with unconventional layout solutions, both at work and in my side projects. And when I'm not at my desk, you can most likely find me cycling or playing racket sports, ideally somewhere without the internet. We are going to kick things off with scratching the surface of the accessibility topics, and this high-level overview is going to give us a sound introduction, which will let us transition to introducing the case study. Afterwards, we are going to start with the live coding session, when we will fix a common accessibility flow, also making the template more semantic. Finally, I'm going to leave you with some key takeaways to have in mind in your day-to-day work. So at this point, you might be wondering, what is the entire accessibility topic about? It is often abbreviated to A11Y, which comes from the 11 letters between A and Y. And it's basically about making your websites usable by as many people as possible. Let's have a look at the main categories and what they mean to us as developers. So first of all, we have the visual impairments, which are about the people who don't have a good vision or who even can't see at all. These can be addressed, first of all, with screen reader support, but also with using fonts that scale or ensuring high contrasts. Besides that, we have mobility impairments, which are about people who rely on keyboard interactions or voice assistant software. This can be accommodated with, first of all, using interactive elements for elements that are supposed to be interactive, and also for ensuring visible focus links around them when focused. Besides that, we have cognitive impairments, and this we can consider, first of all, with using elements that are opinionated, such as links that are blue when not visited and purple when visited, and also reducing unnecessary animations and clutter. It's worth noting that accessibility isn't solely about the users, but that it also improves the developer experience. And one of the reasons for that is that it encourages writing clean semantic HTML, which is easier to reason about, but also more predictable, since rather than using custom behaviors, we rely on native browser behaviors. Let's have a look at this simple example of what would it take to make a regular div function like a button. So first of all, we would need to have the role attribute on it to be interpreted as a button by assistive technologies. We would also need the tab index of 0 to make it tabbable. And finally, we would need to style it to, for instance, support the pointer cursor when we hover over it. We have all of these behaviors built into the standard button elements. And I know this specific scenario might sound trivial and unrealistic to you, because at the end of the day, why would you use a div for a clickable element with plain text? So with that said, let's turn this over to a more practical example, which is an accordion trigger. So over here, we have a section with two panels. And when you have a closer look at them, you're going to notice that the last of them is featuring an outline. Nothing fancy about it, actually, because it's just the standard browser behavior for focused elements. Let's have a look under the hood. So this is something that might be counterintuitive to you, because we are actually wrapping the button element with an H3. So let me explain that at the first place. So when using the heading like this, we are actually making the button text included in the headings hierarchy. And headings hierarchy consists of all the heading levels, all the way from H1, which is the most significant one, to H6, which is the least significant one. With this in place, we are having this text, as I said, included in the hierarchy, and you can consider it as an analogy to a table of contents in a book. And rather than only serving as a visual title in your markup, for the users relying on assistive technologies, it can be also used to navigate through the website with some key bindings that you can compare to how you skim through the table of contents of a blog article. Then finally, we have a button. And as you can see in this snippet, rather than solely using the plain text, it can also make up quite complex markups. Now, it's worth noting that we have an image tag which serves only for decorative purposes, and this needs some particular treatment. So first of all, we are setting the alt attribute, which serves for alternative text in case there were problems with fetching it, to an empty string, which notifies the screen reader that this is only for decoration. Besides that, we have the area hidden set to true, which hides it from the screen reader. Besides that, there are also two area properties on the button, and their purpose is to identify either the state or the purpose of elements, once again to the assistive technologies. So first of all, we have area controls, which points to the ID of the element that gets expanded once we click the button using some custom JavaScript handling, and also area expanded, which communicates the current state of the panel, by default false. And besides making things work for the people that wouldn't be able to use them without accessibility concerns, accessibility also helps respect user preferences, because some of the users have their own way that is the best for them and that works best for them in terms of interacting with the web content. As example, we could, for instance, mention using dark mode, high contrast mode, scalable fonts, or reduced motion. Let's have a look at some example, which once again concerns the accordion. So we are going to have a look how it expands. And as you can notice, when we click on the trigger, we are going to have the body displayed with a smooth animation. And for most of us, this is actually the preferred behavior that looks much better than just a sudden shift to the full height. But like I said, there are some users who might not want this, and there is an easy way to honor this. So once again, let's have a look under the hood. And in this simple CSS snippet, we are starting with styling the accordion content class, which contains the body. First of all, we are starting with height of 0 and overflow hidden so that nothing is displayed when it is in the initial state. Then we can do something interesting because we can hook into the accordion trigger that we've discussed previously using the area expanded attribute. So as you can see, area attributes can not only be used for assistive technologies support, but we can also utilize them in CSS using the standard attribute selector. Then we are using the adjacent symbol combinator in order to target the content, which, like I said, contains the body. Then we are using the calc size CSS function to calculate the new size. And this is a fairly new CSS feature, which basically calculates the size to be the same as for the standard auto value based on the intrinsic size of the content, with a difference that it returns a numeric value, which in opposite to auto can be animated. And now, speaking of honoring preferences, there is a very simple way to achieve this with the prefers reduce motion media query, which takes one of the two values. It could be no preference or reduce. And I highly encourage you to use no preference one for the animations that you think shouldn't be visible for everyone. Coming next, we have the scalable fonts that I mentioned. So here we have some custom properties which are set to rem, which refers to the root element, and the root element can also be tweaked by the user easily. So down below the snippet, we have a screenshot from the Chrome developer tools with the font size settings. Once we set it to a larger value, the root element is going to change from the default 16 pixels that we typically consider to either a larger value and to a smaller value, adapting the interface to what the user expects it to be. Last but not least, we have the focus rings that I briefly mentioned. So as you can see over here on the navbar on the website, one of the elements is featuring a dark focus ring. And even though that's probably not the most aesthetic experience that you can imagine, it serves its purpose of displaying the currently focused elements, which is especially valuable for the users who rely on either keyboard navigation or voice navigation, or, like we are discussing in this chapter, who just prefer this than using mouse. So I highly discourage removing this animation at all, even if you don't like it. And rather than that, consider making it more suitable and also more consistent with the rest of your layout. In this case, with making it a little bit thicker, also setting a color on it and giving it a bit of an offset to make it have a little bit of space around the text. Finally, accessibility is required by law. And I know this might sound unrealistic and far-fetched to you, but what if I told you there was actually a common case of a blind user who sued a major restaurant chain in the US for an inaccessible ordering system? Basically, he couldn't make an order, and the court sided with him. There was a strong basis for this, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically the Title III of it, which has been interpreted by the US courts and the Department of Justice to apply to websites, specifically to the ones which are about public services, such as e-commerce, restaurant, educational institutions, and financial services. Europe is not standing still in this matter either, with its directive called European Accessibility Act, EEA, which obligates the companies to have accessible interfaces, with the fines ranging from 5,000 euros to 20,000 euros per violation, depending on the severity of the issue. And this is actually a very up-to-date topic for the residents of Poland, because the law introducing it is taking effect on June 28th. So now that we have a sound grasp of accessibility, let's turn this over to the case study. We are going to base it on a fairly simple e-commerce application, which is mostly about a variant selector for the product that we would like to order. Our intention is that the variants, rather than only being selectable with mouse click, which is the default behavior for many of us, can also be navigated with keyboard. Let me present what I mean in a brief video, and pay attention to the cursor, which will be sited next to the tiles in order to prove that it doesn't participate in tile selection. Let me also outline it in red. So as you can see, the variants are changed, as well as the main image to the left, but at the same time, we are not using mouse, which is crucial for, like I said, certain group of users. So this raises a fair question of how can we make the tiles navigable with arrow keys? And the answer is actually easier than you might think. It's not really about analog radios, but rather a specific part of it, which is the set of physical buttons with some station presets and with only one of them being pushed at the time. This part gave its name to a standard HTML radio input, which is going to be a perfect fit for our solution. And this might be counterintuitive to you once again, because when you think of a radio button, you imagine it as a circle, which gets either highlighted or filled in when it's selected. So in order to achieve our result, we are going to need a custom solution. With all that said, let's take it over to the live coding session. So we are going to start with a starting point, and let me start explaining the sections of the page. So first of all, we have a simple navbar. We also have the tiles selector, or the variant selector that we've already discussed, which is bound to the main image to the left. There are also some other navigable buttons at the bottom of the page. And now, as you can see, clicking works fine selecting the variants, but the moment I start navigating through the website with tab clicks, as you can see, the navbar works just fine, but once I reach its final element and press tab again, something unexpected is going to happen, because the variant selector actually got skipped, and we have the focus outlined on the decrement button. This is obviously an accessible flaw, because a user who isn't relying on mouse cannot select a variant. Now, let's have a look at the tiles element, and we are quickly going to find out the reason why aren't they working. And the reason is that we are using the standard HTML image elements, which don't have any interactivity built in by default. So let's have a look at the variant selector component, which we are going to have highlighted right now, and see what we can do about this. First of all, let me start explaining the TypeScript file. It's fairly simple, consisting of two inputs, one of them being the variants, which are used for rendering the tiles, and the active variant, which is used for the blue glow around the element. Then we have the variant selected output, which is used for communicating the change to the parent component and changing the main image to the selected variant. Now over to the HTML element. First of all, we have the caption of selected color, which is bound to the currently selected variant. We also have the tiles container, which serves for styling purposes and contains a for loop iterating over the variants and displaying the image tags. At this point, it's worth noting that first of all, we have the active class, which sets the custom styling of the blue outline, and that we also have a click binding to the output that I showed previously. So with all that set and with the radio element introduced, why not to go ahead and add it in our template? So let me type input of type radio. And now in order for a group of radio buttons to be connected together and only for one of them to be pushed at the time, they need to have a common name. In this case, let it be variant. At this point, we will need two property bindings. First of which being the value, which is going to be the variant ID. And we might also want to bind to the standard checked attribute. And for that purpose, let's use the condition that we used to have for the active class. Nice. And last but not least, there is also a standard HTML event that we can use for communicating the change, which is called change. And when that happens, let's use the same event emitter as for the click handler. Let me rebuild the application and let's have a look what happened. So now all the tiles are accompanied with a radio button, and once I once again start navigating all the way from the navbar, we are going to notice something interesting, because the first of the radio button is going to be outlined in black. And now, as I start pressing the arrow keys, we are going to notice that navigation works just fine, and we are able to go for all the tiles and select the one that's interesting to us. Now, once I press the tab button, we are going to navigate to the following section, and we can also use the shift button combination to jump back to the previous one. Nice. So at this point, I mentioned we have a custom solution of a class which is conditionally triggered, and this could actually be replaced with a solution based on standard CSS pseudo classes. So let me remove the active class, and let me turn this over to the CSS file. Now we can grab the active class, we can move it outside of the image selector. And since I mentioned pseudo selectors, let's hook into the input of type radio once again, which is in the checked state. Now we can once again use the adjacent sibling selector that I briefly brought up with the accordion example, and we can use it to target the image. And now, once I rebuild, we are going to notice that we have the same effect that we used to have previously. Let me start tabbing. And this works fine with one exception, because we also have a custom click handler, which is a bit counterintuitive to me, because it's placed on an element which isn't supposed to be interactive at the first place. So we could remove this as well. And now we could also add yet another HTML element, which is the label tag around the input and an image. And the way it works in a scenario like this is that it connects the label with an input in such a way that clicking anything within the label, including the image, will focus it, also triggering the standard behavior. So let's have a look what happens. And now it's taking some time. Yeah, it got a little bit laggy. But now, once I click on the tiles, we are going to notice that we are having this behavior incorporated with the label tag, which is another sweet addition. So at this point, we have these radio elements, and we didn't intend to have them at the first place. We just wanted to have a behavior that mimics them. So now there is a bunch of ways to hide an element like this while maintaining its native behavior. And since we are here for Angular, why not to use an Angular-based solution? For that reason, let me go ahead and let me type npm install Angular CDK. And for this purpose, we are going to use a simple utility class that is exposed by the library, which is called CDK visually hidden. And now at this point, don't get me wrong, adding an entire package like this, which consists of a bunch of tools for building web interactions just for the sole purpose of using a single utility class, is probably not the best solution. But at the same time, it is so widespread that you probably already have it in your project, so it might be worth pointing that out. Now that I have the class in place, we are going to notice that our behavior is not working yet. And the reason for this is that we also need to import it in our CSS file. So let me go ahead and import it with the use keyboard. And also include a mixin, which emits the class that we are using, which is called CDK A11Y visually hidden. With that in place, let me go ahead and save the changes. And as you can see, the radio buttons are no longer present, but the site is getting a little bit laggy once again. But now that it starts working, you are going to notice that the arrow keys are working perfectly for changing through the tiles. And we are almost there. And the reason I've used the word almost is that once I tap through to the next section and then tap back to the variant selector, you're going to notice that there is no distinction between outlining the currently selected element with the focus somewhere else in the application, let it be the decrement button or the input for the amount of t-shirts, and also for navigating through the tiles. So one of the ways we could accommodate it is, once again, using a standard browser behavior, which is a pseudo selector. So at this point, let me duplicate the selector that we used to have. Let me replace the pseudo selector with focus. And now, since the browser uses black outlines in each case, let's also use the black color for it for consistency. And also to make it stand out a little from the blue indicator, let's make it a little bit thicker. So now let me save my changes. Let me start navigating. And once I reach our variant selector, we are going to notice that the color of the outline turned black and that it's also thicker, which looks correct to me and also looks consistent with the other interactive elements on the website. So this is already really good to me. And with that in place, we could also accommodate some of the assistive technologies so that our component is more inclusive and also more intuitive for all the users. And now that we have turned this content of the for loop into a set of labels along with inputs, this actually sounds like a perfect scenario to be grouped within a field set attribute. It is typically used within the forms, but in a real-life scenario, you will most likely have a component like this contained in the form. So let me go ahead and let me use the field set tag. Now, a field set tag typically consists of the legend tag, which displays the caption for the group. And I cannot think of a better candidate for it than the existing div with the selected color text. So let's go ahead and let's turn this to the legend tag. And now, for all the sighted users, selecting the variant is pretty intuitive and obvious because we can see the colors of the t-shirts on the tiles. But we have to have in mind that this is not the case for all the users. And in order to accommodate them, the ones using the screen reader, for instance, we can use yet another ARIA property, which in this case would be ARIA label, which would, in this particular scenario, mean read this aloud for the screen reader when the element is focused. So now, in order to use it with property binding in Angular, we obviously have to wrap it in square brackets, but at the same time also prepend it with attr. And let's use the variant name for it. Now, last but not least, a field set by default has an area role of group, which is pretty close to what we want. But since this is a group of radio buttons, why not to use a radio group in this particular scenario? Nice. So this is looking pretty good to me already. The tiles are interactive both with mouse clicks for the users who interact with web content like this, but it also supports keyboard navigation, as well as tabbing from the section and tabbing to the section. Perfect. And I think we are in a good moment to return to our presentation and summarize what we've just done. So first of all, we have replaced a solution which had an accessibility flow because it consisted of image tags, and we have replaced it with radio buttons that use the images as a label. Then we have also removed a custom class that was used for styling and turned conditionally, and we have used pseudo selectors instead. Finally, we have replaced some of the divs which don't have any semantic meanings to some elements that could be helpful for users relying on assistive technologies. So what I would like you to remember after this talk is that, first of all, accessibility isn't actually only about supporting assistive technologies and users who rely on them, but it actually improves the experience for everyone, be it someone who prefers the dark mode or using the keyboard for navigating through the website. Also, it significantly improves the developer experience, as I've just tried to prove to you. Besides that, overlooking accessibility can hurt your business, from legal risk to lost users and also reputation decline. As I've also tried to show you, coding with accessibility in mind doesn't really have to be hard or time-consuming. Before we end, I also highly encourage you to set up a screen reader and start playing around with it, since all the area roles and properties that I was presenting, as well as importance of semantic HTML, might sound a bit abstract to you, and using a screen reader gives you a new, fresh perspective, also making you a better developer overall. The good news is that you most likely have a software like this incorporated in your operating system, with Narrator for Windows, Orca for GNOME-based Linux distributions, and VoiceOver for iOS. With all that said, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm also leaving a link to the repository where you can also follow the steps from the live coding, as well as get familiar with some learning resources that I recommend for getting started with accessibility. So thank you all, and let me turn this over back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Damian. That was really great talk, especially right now, due to some law changes in the European Union, where more and more sites will need to be really accessible. We have already some questions, so I will go directly to them. Piotr asked the questions, but I see that it's like spread across a few messages. So is there a preferred way to navigate via the keyboard? And also then, after all, he adds like a select or radio group as you demonstrate that arrows are preferred. So I guess like which way of navigation is preferred when we have tabs and arrows. That's how I understand this whole message.
Sure. So first of all, we actually have some built-in behaviors which we don't need to handle manually. And as you could see in the case of radio buttons, I didn't have to write any custom event handlers. We just have them worked with arrows by design. On the other hand, for the buttons and for the inputs, it is an opinionated pattern to use tabs for switching between them. And if you are asking for some patterns, I highly encourage the w3.org website, which is linked in the learning resources in the README of my project, which features some section with all these patterns to be followed described.
Thanks. There is another question from Michał. How do you handle differences between different screen readers?
I'm not sure if I understand that question correctly, because different screen readers, for instance, might have, on one hand, different key bindings, but they might also interpret ARIA attributes in a different meaning. So I don't really have a good answer for that. What I can say is that I've been working with two of them. So I've used NVDA when I was using Linux, and I used Orca. And typically when you follow the opinionated patterns, they should work well just fine following the behavior that you intended to have.
Yeah, so just to help me also understand, so as you said, if we have like opinionated way how to write the code to be accessible in the proper way by these devices, so probably how this device reads is on the side of this probably device, right? To correctly understand some well-defined set of rules.
Yes, so it is built in the screen reader to support the behaviors that we write in the HTML in some opinionated way.
Okay. And there is one more question from Anna. Why we should choose SDK styles to hide the radio button over just visibility hidden?
And that's a good question, because if you use visibility hidden, then the event would be taken out from the accessibility tree and it wouldn't be focusable anyway. So for instance, if you were working on this on your own, rather than using visibility hidden, you could, for instance, use opacity 0, which would then support focus.
Let's see a few seconds whether there will be more questions. Okay, so probably there will not be more questions. So Damian, thank you very much again. It was really great and important presentations. And I hope to see you in some future meetups, maybe some upcoming one after the summer.
Thank you, Matt. I'll be looking forward, and it was a pleasure to be here. Thanks.